Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good after midnight, whatever time you're watching this video. Welcome to another episode of Greg Blends. And in today's episode, we're going to be making literal garbage in Blender. But before we dive into that, I do want to talk a little bit about this video style and the previous video that I just uploaded. If you haven't seen it, on the same day that I uploaded this video, I also uploaded a channel update video where I talk about where I've been and what I might consider doing with the channel in the future. And at the end of that video, I mentioned the video you're currently watching, where basically today we're going to be making some assets for a game that I want to develop. I might not do it. I might just make it a demo or something, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But basically, this video, I recorded myself making some assets, and it took me about an hour and 50 minutes. But this video is only 20 minutes. So what I'm going to be doing is playing the footage back at like 5x speed and kind of narrating it as I go. So it's not a tutorial, and it's also not real-time narration, but rather, because I'm going to be making a lot of assets for this game, I figured I may as well record it while I work and then, put some voiceover at the end so that you guys could have some interesting content. So this is a new style I'm trying out. Because I'm already going to be doing the work, I figured I may as well share it with the world. So without further ado, I'm going to press play. And I'm going to narrate the footage that I previously recorded. Alright, so as you can see, we're making literal garbage, or rather, we're making garbage cans. But you can imagine that they're full of garbage, and we're making them. So I'm going to do about, maybe 6 or 7 different styles of trash cans. And what is this for? Well, basically, I want to make kind of a 90s retro aesthetic mall in Blender. I kind of, want to go for like the vaporwave kind of nostalgic feeling and put that into the new Unreal 5 engine. Now, currently I am a Unity developer. I love Unity, but I've always been curious to learn Unreal. And the Unreal 5 engine has just been released in beta, and I think it's set to come out next year. So, I want to play with it, but I also want to have something to do with it. And I thought it would be fun to make, basically, imagine you're exploring a 90s mall, and there's like a filter post-processing effect over the screen to kind of make it look like maybe it's some lost footage or, whatever, found footage or whatever, like from someone's VHS camera or something in the 90s. So it's going to take place in the 90s, and I've already modeled about 200 storefronts. Well, just the signs, basically, like the glowing signs that are above the stores. I have to do like the details of like the storefronts and everything. And I have to actually put content in those stores. Right now they're just a bunch of empty boxes, but it's really cool. So it's a 2-story mall. It has a few different wings. It has a food court. It has little back alley hallways that connect everything, like the parts that the normal people don't get to go into. It has some underground tunnels. It has like a warehouse area. So I'm basically just trying to make a 90s era mall that you can explore. And I have a few ideas for some games that I could do with this, but I'm not going to talk too much about that because I don't really know what I'm going to do with it. I'm mostly just doing it for fun and as an excuse to try to make a complicated map in the new Unreal 5 engine. So as you can see, we're already almost done with the very first garbage can, and I didn't narrate this one too much. Basically, I started with a cube, I extruded, and I did some box cuts. I used the bevel modifier in one place, but really, there's nothing too exciting about that one. But each of these garbage cans, I did take a slightly different approach. As you can see for this one, I started with a sphere, rotated it, cut off the bottom half, and then extruded the bottom circle all the way down to make the basic shape of the trash can. Now, one thing that you'll see in the course of this video is that when you're modeling, you make mistakes. And when, you watch a YouTube on, when you watch a video on YouTube, often tutorials are perfect, right? The modeler never makes any mistakes. They just, practice, they do it, they have a script, everything is prepared ahead of time, and then they make like a perfect tutorial. But that's not really how modeling works in the real world. Usually you kind of have an idea of what you want to do, but just like that you saw right there, I didn't like the way that curve was looking, and so I decided to undo it and then correct my mistake, duplicate that half of the sphere, put it all back, and I had a little render problem, so I turned on the face orientation things so that I could see that some of my faces were backwards, and then I tried again. And that's a much more realistic approach to modeling. When you're modeling, you will try something and it won't work. You'll, just take your best shot at it and you won't be happy with the results. And sometimes you have to go back and do it again. And that's something you really don't see with tutorials where everything is planned in advance and everything is perfect, and it doesn't really give a sense of what it's like to actually be a modeler. And modelers make mistakes all the time. Same is true in engineering. I'm also a software engineer. So constantly I write code that doesn't do exactly what I thought it would, or it works, but it's slow, or, various different things like that. So often you have to go back and try again. And so the interesting thing about this style of video is if you look at the time in the bottom right corner, it's about 11:23 when I was recording this. So you can actually see the clock increase in real time. And like I said, I forget how many I did, like 6 or 7 trash cans, took about 2 hours. And, I just had a podcast going on in the background. And whenever I work, I like to have podcasts, YouTube videos, or music playing. And so that's one thing that makes it a little bit hard to record YouTube videos, because if you have to be narrating it, it's... you can't really do anything else while you're modeling, and I enjoy modeling the most when I have some interesting thing to listen to. Another thing, too, is when you're modeling in real time, like I said, you make mistakes. And if you make a mistake and people are watching your video, well, then they have to watch you fix the mistake. And that takes a little bit of time when it's in real time. But when it's fast-forwarded like this, we're currently playing at 5x speed. You can kind of see that I make a mistake, and then I also fix it really quickly. Now, this model... The first two I used traditional modeling techniques, but this one I decided to use subsurface modeling. So I created a cube, I added the subsurface modifier on it, and then I carefully placed my edge loops to kind of get the curves that I wanted. And ultimately, this was a mistake. I do like subsurface modeling, and there are some models where it's just super handy, but the problem with subsurface modeling is that when you actually apply the modifier, it creates a lot of geometry, and then you have to go and clean up the redundant geometry. These are for a game engine, and while the UE5 engine supposedly has like unlimited polygon support because it has its built-in nano system or whatever it's called that lets you dynamically load like really high resolution meshes and will optimize them for a display and have built-in levels of detail and stuff like that. I don't want to abuse that system. I'm very much a traditional modeler in that sense, in that I want to make models that are optimized for game engines. I don't want to just have a magical Unreal Engine that I could throw anything in and it will just work. And even though that's the promise of Unreal 5, I still don't want to. maybe, in a year or so, I'll change my mind and be like, hell yeah, let's just use all of the triangles. But I'm not there yet, and I don't think I ever will be there. I think it doesn't make sense to waste so much geometry, and as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm actually going through and I'm deleting edge loops that are redundant. So the problem with subsurface modeling is while you can get curves that look really good, you then have to go in and do a lot of manual cleanup, which is not as fun. So this was, I think, the only model that I tried this technique on, and this used to be the only technique I used. When I first got good at Blender, I only used subsurface modeling techniques, and then I would always clean up after. But as I've grown, I've started relying more on the traditional methods. Well, subsurface is technically a traditional method, but it's one that requires a lot of cleanup. So then I've just kind of started relying on some of the more basic approaches, and those work pretty well. And you'll see that in the next couple trash cans. I use a lot of those things like the bevel modifier and so forth. But here I made a mistake when I was cleaning up because I accidentally deleted different edges on the left side than I did on the right side. So I was like, you know what, let's just duplicate this and then put a mirror modifier on there so that both sides look exactly the same. And then now that I have a mesh that looks a lot more simple and has a lot fewer polygons, I went in and I recreated the top so that it would look good, and try to look like the reference photo. Now, another thing is, while I'm trying to make these models look realistic, I'm not necessarily trying to match the image exactly. I've done photorealistic modeling professionally before. It was my job at Google. I had to make products that looked 100% like a photo, and I'm pretty good at that. I really enjoy that, but in this case, no one's checking to see if this is an actual trash can that's been manufactured. I just need to get it close because it's for a game, and I'm going to try to make it look photorealistic for the game, but not necessarily photorealistic to the reference photo. Now, another thing, you can see I'm making materials. It was really quick there, but I made a plastic material that had a little bit of noise for the bump map, and I'm not doing any texture painting. And I can't do texture painting yet because the materials are not set up for that. I'm just using the generated UV coordinates and so forth. But I will I think in a future video, explain how to convert these graphics to be ready for a game engine. Because as you can see, I'm using, for this one I'm using image textures, which would work in Unreal or Unity. But for the other ones where I use the noise texture that comes with Blender, you can't really export that because it's a dynamic texture that Blender creates. So you have to convert that, and the process is called texture baking. And so what I want to do is just make one texture for all 7 trash cans or whatever, and then bake the textures, and then export that to Unreal or whatever game engine, right? So that I may do in a separate video, but this video is just doing the modeling. However, once I have the textures ready and baked, then I can start painting some texture data onto them. And so right now, all of the trash cans are perfectly clean. They're basically an ideal form of the object. But before they're in the game engine, I have to paint some dirt and some grime and some grunge and some scratches and so forth onto them. So here I'm making the top part, a separate model to start with, and I'm basically just using loop cuts on a cube that I extruded a few times. I use the bevel modifier on the back edge to, I haven't done that yet, I'm going to do that soon, to create the kind of curve of the trash can. Here we go. And that's really cool. You can just select some edges, press Control B, and then use your mouse scroll wheel to determine the number of cuts. And so I'm just basically boxing out the basic shape of the trash can, and then after I get the basic rough shape in, I will go and use the bevel modifier again to create all those individual curves. So, and as you can see, I haven't seen one of these, I don't know what they're called, like pebble-style trash cans in a while, but I remember as part of my childhood, like in the 90s, these were everywhere. At airports, at malls, at parks, like this style of like pebble trash can was everywhere. And I can't say I've seen it recently. I'm sure they must still exist, but I don't know. Maybe it's just because they're gross. Like I always kind of associated those kind of pebble shape with like, oh, that's like a gross garbage can. Maybe that like kind of had some negative impact and people decided they don't like that style. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. Maybe these exist everywhere and I just haven't seen one in a while. Where actually at the end of this video, I'm going to be making a garbage can that is extremely common. And I live in New York City and I see them all over New York, but they're pretty much just a universal trash can that has been around forever. And as you can see, I duplicated the material that I used for the previous trash can, and I just brought the saturation and the value down for that color to make a little bit, I brought the saturation up, the value down to make a darker brown for that. And you can see I have all my bevels applied now, and I'm pretty happy with how this guy's come out. I think, so at this point, this is another one of those situations where if you look at the reference photo, I did want to get a little bit closer just because it looked unnatural. And that's actually an interesting topic that I learned early on when I was 3D modeling. A lot of times, how do I say it? A lot of times we don't look very closely at the objects in our surroundings because they're not important. Like we don't really look at a trash can close up that much. So you'd think that there's a lot of wiggle room for making it look right. But it turns out if you make it slightly off, even though you've never studied this trash can in your life before, when you see it and the proportions are a little bit weird, you say something is not right about that. That the trash can, the way I had it modeled like a minute ago, could actually exist in real life, but something looked wrong about it, and I had to go back in there and try again. And I think what I ended up with, I'm actually really happy. It's not exactly the same as the reference photo, but I didn't need it to be. It just needed to be in the ballpark, because, you know, once it's in a game, it'll fit its environment, and as long as it looks like a real trash can, then it will work. It doesn't have to look like the exact trash can, it just has to look like a real trash can. And so even though I had built the top to that previous trash can, it didn't look quite right yet, so I had to go back and do some adjusting to it after the fact. So here I'm reusing that same material. I am going to change it up a little bit in the second part of this trash can, but this was a really easy one. Like, you know, just basically extrude a circle a bunch of times, bring it up to a cone on the top, and then assign some materials to it. Of course, I have to add some bevels, which I'm going to do here. I really got addicted to that bevel tool. I used to only use the bevel modifier, but then when I realized you can just select an edge loop with Alt and then click to select, and then press Control B to do a bevel, that changed my world. Because now, one of the reasons why I used to use subsurface modeling all the time was because it was the best way I could use to get like nice, really rounded corners everywhere. But like I said, it leaves you with that problem of having to do a lot of mesh cleanup. But with the bevel tool, I can just do all that perfect round corners, and the model that comes out is pretty much perfect. So here I duplicated the pebbles material, and I'm just going to bring the saturation up and the value down, and I pretty much color match that. It's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be in the ballpark. All right, and let's do a trash bag this time. So this time I just decided to start with a icosphere. I feel like these ones are really good for deforming, because with a UV sphere, you have basically like latitude and longitude lines making up the shape of the sphere. But what that means is you have two dense points at the top of the sphere, and then the sides of the sphere are like a perfect grid. They're not uniform, which means if you're going to do like weird distortions on them, they will distort unevenly and you'll have pinching points. With an icosphere, it's kind of like a soccer ball where all the triangles on it instead of hexagons are like evenly spaced in the same size. So if you're going to do proportional editing on it, it'll actually just look more uniform when you're done. So I put those red lines on the surface are seams, and using seams for texture unwrapping are really useful. So I just put some seams on there, did the basic unwrap command, and here's a cool trick. So I got that texture for the plastic bag for free online, and all I did is I took it into a hue saturation node, brought down the saturation so it's grayscale, and then I put it into a color contrast node to create more contrast and brightness, and then I put that into a bump map node. So I actually used the color texture as the bump texture, which is a really handy technique when you're working in Blender, because you can use one texture to be both a normal map, technically a bump map, as well as a diffuse map. And that is really powerful because every texture that you load into your scene adds complexity. And not only to the scene, but also when you're rendering, it has to copy that texture into the graphics card, and it takes more RAM, and your project just becomes bigger. And so I didn't need to make a custom normal map for that garbage bag, so I didn't. I just used the texture that was already there. But like I said, for a game engine, you can't do that. For a game engine, you do have to have a normal map, but that will be taking care of they'll be taking care of the texture baking process, because whatever it is, 7 of these trash cans or whatever, I'll have share textures. So I'll make one texture for all the image data, one texture for all the bump data, and maybe another texture for like shadow or ambient occlusion or whatever. But I'll be able to have like one texture for 7 models, essentially. And so I'll bake that data in there, and I'll have a proper normal map. But while I'm modeling, it's a really handy technique to just reuse your diffuse texture. You can just make it, you can just desaturate it and then use it as a bump map. You might have to invert it depending on how it looks like, but yeah, so this was a really easy model, basically just a cylinder that I put a mirror modifier on so I could duplicate for the handles on each side. And then I put another cylinder in the middle to become the trash bag. And then just almost like the icing on the donut tutorial from Blender Guru, I just kind of extruded these edges and brought them down a little bit to create some variety. It is low poly. It doesn't look the best because you could see that it's low poly. And here I was trying to bevel, and for some reason the bevel modifier was spazzing out, so I made sure my faces were in the correct orientation. And I didn't like how low these, or how high up these flaps were, so I just brought them down, just randomly, chose random edges. Reprojected the texture for the trash bag because it was starting to look a little bit warped. But otherwise, that was pretty straightforward. So, have another trash bin. Now, I may actually put trash in them at some point. Obviously, all the other ones kind of have closed tops, which is why I chose them, so I didn't have to put like a bunch of junk in it. This one, I may have to at some point go in and create a bunch of items piled in there. But the other ones are okay. Now, this is the one that you see everywhere. I don't know if that actually is 5th Avenue, New York. It says 5th Avenue on our reference photo over there. Or if it's some other 5th Avenue, but it doesn't matter because I see these everywhere. I've seen them in California, I've seen them in New York. This is like the most universal outdoor trash can of all time. It probably has a name. I'd be kind of curious to know what that trash can's called. It's like probably has like some fancy, like the marketing team for the trash can probably came up with some stupid fancy name for it. Maybe that's what the name is. This is the 5th Avenue trash can. The most elite trash can for the most elite trash. So anyways, what I'm about to do for this one is actually kind of a cool trick. Now, I didn't want to model in all of those bars because that would be expensive. Each one of those would take up a bunch of polygons, which would mean a bunch of triangles, which would mean it would be a waste, especially for a trash can, which is a throwaway prop. Badunch. But it's background element. It's not the focus point of anything, unless you're doing a movie about trash cans. Maybe if you're Pixar and you're doing a movie about trash cans that come to life when no one's around, the secret lives of trash cans. If they're not the hero model to say, it's okay to take shortcuts. And so what I'm doing here is I'm actually using a mix shader with the transparent BDS shader and the principled BSDF shader. And so then I'm going to use this gradient stripe texture I made in Photoshop, and I'm going to create a separate UV set to control just where I want the stripes to be. So the model will have, I'm turning on the EV settings for alpha right here. The model will have basically two different materials, one for the kind of green metal, the painted green metal, and then this other one which uses the stripes, and I'm adjusting the UV coordinates to determine where there's transparency on the surface of it. And with that, as you can see, it's starting to work. Now, wherever it's white, it'll be solid, and wherever it's black, it'll be completely transparent. And what I did is I just took the rest of the UV coordinates for the model, and I just put them on one of the white areas. So the entire model is solid except for where I put those stripes. And then that way, it's relying on an alpha texture, but it's very low poly. And I believe using an alpha texture, for something like this, it would probably be better to do it this way, because even though the alpha might take a little bit more processing to render, it's rendering many fewer triangles overall. So that's how I kind of created that trash can. And here we are. Here's all of the trash cans. I'll just put a floor there, put on some basic rendering, and here is each trash can. And of course, I'm going to do some last minute tweaks, change some of the colors. I decided to make this, I think the material didn't look like metallic enough or shiny enough, and the opening was too wide compared to my reference photo. And yeah, I made that one a little bit more squat, just by selecting everything, scaling with Shift Z, which will scale on both X and Y, but not Z. And then I took a little bit of time to kind of make that dome look a little bit better, because before it was more pointy, like a pyramid, or a cone, I should say. It wasn't quite dome-like, and so I did that. And then I was looking at the bottom, I felt like this should be a little bit bigger to kind of make it more pronounced. And there we go. And the reference photo I used for the green one was actually a weird photo, so the can did look a little bit squished. I don't think the reference photo is actually accurate for that can. I think it's too narrow, especially from what I remember online, or I mean in real life. But Yeah, so I made it a little bit more squat and more in line with the size of the other trash cans because I feel like that reference photo was just a bad reference photo that I had chosen. But anyways, so that's what 2 hours of work looks like for me in Blender. I was able to do 7 trash cans and a bag of trash. And these will be props for this 90s aesthetic, or if I speak it in Vaporwave, aesthetic, with like the spaces between the letters. And so that these will be props for that thing that I'm working on. I really don't know what I'm going to do with it yet. I have some ideas for games, but I won't get into them there because I don't want to commit to one. I might do it in VR because I think it'd be kind of fun to have like a 90s mall VR explorer or something like that. I thought about all kinds of different things that I could do with it, but these will be props for that. And so let me know what you thought of this style of video, because this type of video I can actually do a lot more frequently because I'm going to be making a lot of assets in the coming weeks and months. And if I just record myself while I'm working, I can have my podcasts on in the background, I can have whatever I'm doing, listening to music, etc., and just record my work. And when I'm done, I can just kind of do a recap, kind of like we just did, where I just blast you with information and talk about things as we go. And then that way you can see kind of how a professional will work. And yeah, so let me know if you'd like to see more of these videos. Like I said, these are not game engine ready yet because I have to bake the textures. And that's a process that I think I should do an actual tutorial on, which if I do it, it's probably going to be the next video. Maybe not, who knows? But the reason why is because baking textures is kind of a confusing topic. I certainly struggled with it when it was new, or when I was new to it, and I think somebody who knows what they're doing with that and could sit down and just explain it really easily, I think would be valuable to the community. So I might do that. I might make a video of baking these textures and getting these assets game engine ready, because right now they're Blender ready, but because they're relying on those, like I said, the procedural noise textures and multiple UV sets in a couple cases and stuff like that, these would not look correct in a game engine yet, but I can make them. The basic trick is, while these use PBR textures, which is physical-based rendering, and they use, physical-based materials, PBR materials, the textures are not PBR. But if I bake the textures, they will be, and then they'd be compatible with any game engine, basically. So I might do that video next, but let me know if you enjoyed this video, if you'd like to see more like this, because I'm going to be making a lot of props, and I can record and share all that with you. And also, if you haven't already, make sure to check out the other video where I gave a basic channel update. I talk about making classic video game ROMs, talk about making a music software inspired by Blender, and various other things that I might consider doing with the channel in the future. So I would love to hear your feedback. I don't know which of these videos the algorithm is going to select to show you. Maybe neither, maybe both. But whatever the case is, if you haven't seen that video, go check it out so that you could tell me what you think the future of the channel should be. Anyways, I think that about does it. Yeah, what's the YouTube shenanigans? Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. All right, ta-ta for now.